When the soldiers lifted her into the carriage, her hands were trembling uncontrollably. She was only 16 years old. In the palace records, her name appears only as Han the Concubine, one of the Korean tribute women sent to the Ming court. Minutes earlier, she had been handed over to the Chinese emperor. Her mother wept as she signed the official document. Because she could not write, she could only press an ink mark at the bottom of the page. That signature expressed another reality as well. There was one less mouth to feed at home. In times of famine, one fewer child needed to be fed. Han and the 15 Korean girls selected alongside her were transported for weeks in a sealed carriage. The curtains were drawn. They were forbidden from looking outside. They were even forbidden from speaking. Along the way, a girl who tried to escape was caught and brought back. Her hand had been crushed. She died of infection a few days later. Her body was left by the roadside. The others understood the system in that moment. Resistance was not an option. When the gates of the Forbidden City closed behind her, Han quickly grasped the truth. Serving the Son of Heaven had nothing to do with honor. She would live within those walls for 16 years. She would witness an entire harem vanish overnight. She would beg to see her mother one last time, and in the end, she would die wrapped in white silk. If you're new to the channel, subscribe and leave a like if you want these stories to keep being uncovered, because what comes next is even darker. Han's story actually begins at the same point as the stories of tens of thousands of women, with a system that harvested young women as if they were a crop. When people think of Chinese imperial concubines, they usually picture an elegant tableau, beautiful women in embroidered silks, court ladies composing poetry, a life of luxury serving the most powerful man in Asia. That image is the product of propaganda. The imperial concubinage system endured for more than 2,000 years. During that time, tens of thousands of women disappeared behind the red walls of the Forbidden City. And what most people fail to realize is this: concubines were not wives. Under imperial law, they were not recognized as fully human in the complete sense. Their legal status was placed in the same category as valuable possessions. They were literally equated with porcelain vases. Every 3 years, imperial officials would travel through the provinces conducting a process called the Shunu selection. The name sounds elegant, almost like a ceremonial competition. But what actually took place was something entirely different. This was not an examination. This was the forced collection of young women, a state-organized human harvest. During the Ming Dynasty, no family was exempt from this process. All unmarried girls of eligible age were required to be presented to the officials. Concealing a daughter was not merely considered a violation of the rules. It was an offense that could result in death for the entire family. Candidates were examined one by eunuchs and palace physicians. Every centimeter of their bodies was carefully inspected. Birthmarks, scars, deformities. Even the slightest flaw was grounds for elimination. Those who passed this examination were taken away immediately. Families were paid a small compensation. But refusing this payment effectively meant defying the emperor. In other words, the payment was not a voluntary agreement. It was a compulsory ritual. In truth, the system had no need for abduction. Poverty already accomplished the same thing. So what did the families left behind do? Most never heard from their daughters again. Sending letters was forbidden. Visiting was impossible. Rarely, if a concubine rose to a high position within the palace, her family might be granted a small stipend, but for the vast majority, their daughters vanished completely behind the red walls of the Forbidden City. Some families held funeral ceremonies for daughters who were still alive, because they had understood the truth. The girl they had raised no longer existed. Han had been brought to China as part of a different tributary group. Korea was sending women to the Ming court as part of diplomatic arrangements. During the Ming Dynasty, this practice had evolved into a regularized form of tribute. Between 1408 and 1435, more than 100 young Korean women were taken to the Forbidden City. not as visitors, but as property of the palace. The day Han stepped through the palace gates, her existence as an individual effectively came to an end. She was no longer a human being. She was a record number, merely one among the countless possessions owned by the Son of Heaven. But before beginning palace service, they had to be broken. The selected women were not taken directly into the harem. First, they were put through a process the eunuchs called purification. This period could last anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. The first stage was the erasure of identity. Their hair was cut. In Chinese culture, this carried an explicit meaning of humiliation. Their names were removed and replaced with numbers or generic titles. They were forbidden from speaking of their families. Mentioning their mothers could result in physical punishment. Personal belongings they had brought from home were collected and burned. The women slept in crowded dormitories, about 20 people to a room. They were woken before dawn and could sleep only after midnight. This relentless schedule left them perpetually exhausted. At this point, resistance was not merely forbidden, it was physically nearly impossible. The second stage was obedience training. The women were taught to bow in dozens of different ways. Each day they would repeat these movements for approximately 8 hours. If a greeting was performed incorrectly, they were struck on the legs with bamboo rods. Many women carried the scars of these wounds for the rest of their lives. They learned to walk silently. They learned to keep their gaze lowered. They learned not to speak unless spoken to. They learned to occupy as little space as possible in their surroundings. And they learned to smile even when they were screaming inside. A training manual surviving from the Qing Dynasty period lists 47 separate rules for how to stand in the emperor's presence. 47 different ways of existing in a single moment. Violating any one of these rules meant punishment. The third stage was the process of preparation for service to the emperor. There is no need to describe the details in graphic terms. However, historical documents clearly describe a systematic preparation process designed to eliminate physical and psychological resistance. Women were examined regularly every month. Those deemed inadequate were sent for procedures that palace records refer to, with cool composure, as treatment. The palace's medical registers describe these practices in an almost emotionless language. Notes from 1723 mention resistant candidates and preparation protocols requiring multiple sessions. The clinical language used in these texts conceals only with the thinnest veil what was actually done to these women behind the palace walls of the Qing Dynasty period. These were ordinary administrative records, official documents written as though they concerned not people, but animals being trained. At the end of this process, lasting many months, the women who survived were deemed ready. But in reality, what they were ready for was simply to pass through the door of a new world, a world in which the suffering had only just begun. After training was completed, the young women were registered into the formal palace system. And it was at that point that another hell began. The palace hierarchy was ruthlessly unforgiving. At the very top stood the empress, the emperor's sole official wife. Directly below her were the imperial consorts. Then came high-ranking concubines divided into several different grades. At the bottom were the ordinary concubines. Their numbers sometimes reached into the hundreds. And below them were the young candidates, preparatory women whose fates had not yet been determined. Rank governed every detail of life. How much food you would receive, what colors of clothing you were permitted to wear, the size of your room, how many servants you would have, even which dishes your meals would be served on. The empress received more than 22 pounds of the finest meat each day. A concubine of the lowest rank could barely receive 4 pounds, and even that often failed to reach them, because some eunuchs would steal the provisions before they arrived at the kitchen. For this reason, many low-ranking concubines suffered from chronic malnutrition. Their teeth would begin to fall out, their hair would thin, their faces would hollow quickly. Within just a few years, they would look as though they had aged by decades. And one of the system's most bitter ironies was this: the more their appearance deteriorated, the less likely they were to be summoned by the emperor. There was a cycle of decline hidden within this very arrangement. The emperor did not go to the concubines' chambers. They were summoned. Each evening, a eunuch would bring wooden tablets bearing the names and portraits of eligible women before the emperor. The emperor would select one, and then the ceremony would begin. The selected concubine would first be taken to the bathing palace. Female attendants would wash her, arrange her hair, and prepare her, but they would not dress her again. Instead, they would wrap her in a silk covering, like a package. Only her face remained exposed. The reason was simple. A woman wearing clothing could conceal a weapon. 2 eunuchs would then carry her to the emperor's chamber. They would open the covering at the foot of the bed, and the woman would be deposited onto the bed completely naked. She was required to crawl toward the emperor without raising her eyes. And there was one further detail that is almost never told. One of the head eunuchs would remain in the room throughout the encounter. He would stand behind a screen, invisible but present. His duty was to measure the time. When exactly 30 minutes had passed, he would announce aloud, "It is time to preserve the golden essence of the Son of Heaven." This was a warning. The emperor was required to finish immediately. If he did not, the eunuch would enter and physically remove the concubine from the room. After each encounter, the woman was examined by a palace physician. All details were recorded. The reason was clear. If she became pregnant, there must be no doubt whatsoever that the child truly belonged to the emperor. But what made the system truly unsettling lay elsewhere. Most concubines were never summoned, not even once. The harem housed hundreds of women. Sometimes the number exceeded 1,000. The emperor, however, might summon 1 or 2 women per week. The fate of the rest was determined by mathematics. A concubine could spend her entire life waiting for a summons that would never come, growing old in silence, watching younger girls be brought to the palace each year, knowing that the sole reason, the sole purpose for which she had been torn from her family would never come to pass. And yet, she was not permitted to leave. She could not marry. She could not have children with another man. She was now like property placed in storage, an object kept to one side as long as it went unused. There was nothing she could do, only wait. As time passed, the women began to turn against one another. The Imperial harem was not merely a prison, it was also an arena. Hundreds of women were competing to win the attention of a single man, and all of them knew the same truth. A single pregnancy could change a woman's fate entirely. It could either give her everything or destroy everything. The result was an invisible war that persisted across centuries. Concubines mixed poison into rivals' food. They bribed eunuchs to remove rival women's names from the selection tablets. Some spread rumors throughout the palace to make other women fall out of the emperor's favor. Historical documents even record that some women mixed abortifacient herbs into the tea of pregnant rivals. If the baby died, the mother's future in the palace generally ended along with it. This logic did not emerge only in the later imperial periods. The same competitive atmosphere existed centuries before the Qing Dynasty. There is a famous story told about Wu Zetian, one of the very few women in Chinese history to rule the empire in her own name. According to the account, she smothered her own newborn daughter and pinned the blame on a rival concubine. That woman was executed, and Wu eventually became empress. Historians debate the accuracy of this story, but the very fact that it is found credible speaks volumes about the atmosphere inside the palace. Violence was not always physical. Psychological warfare was constant. Senior concubines would humiliate and keep pressure on younger ones. Women who were the emperor's favorites were isolated by others and made subject to efforts to render them powerless. Alliances were formed and dissolved the following day, depending on whom the emperor glanced at during dinner. A narrative from the Qing Dynasty period recounts how a concubine pretended to be friends with a rival for 3 years. Then, when the empress launched an investigation into disloyalty, she testified against her. The outcome was clear. The rival woman was demoted to servant status. Her children were taken from her. This practice was not carried out merely for the sake of cruelty, it was also a survival mechanism. In a system where women had no real power outside the emperor's interest, eliminating rivals often became the only strategy that worked. The tragic aspect of the matter was this: the system gradually turned its victims into perpetrators. Women who had been abducted, trained, and stripped of their identities were learning to do the same to others, because the alternative was simple: to be the first one destroyed. And if a concubine managed to survive this invisible internal war, if she captured the emperor's attention, if she became pregnant, it was precisely at that point that the true nightmare began. Contrary to what most people might expect, for a low-ranking concubine, becoming pregnant was often the worst thing that could happen to her. Logic suggests otherwise. Bearing the emperor's child should have elevated a woman's status, but the palace's reality was far harsher. A concubine who became pregnant would be sent to the most remote sections of the Forbidden City. She would live under constant surveillance for 9 months. She could receive no visitors, she could send no letters, she was not permitted to walk in the gardens. And when the birth occurred, the child was immediately separated from its mother. If the baby was a boy, it was given to wet nurses. It would be raised in another section of the palace. Its biological mother might see it once or twice a year, under the supervision of eunuchs, and most often without even being permitted to touch it. If the baby was a girl, she would most often simply disappear. Imperial records frequently did not even bother to record the fate of daughters born to low-ranking concubines. Some documents tell of desperate women who secretly used abortifacient herbs to escape this cycle. These women preferred to risk their own lives rather than draw their daughters into the same system. And if a son died, the blame was most often sought in the mother. She could be accused of negligence, sometimes even of outright murder. Even when children died of ordinary illnesses, responsibility was frequently placed on the mother. In such a circumstance, she could be demoted in rank, exiled to the most remote sections of the palace, or face a harsher punishment still. In a case from the Qing Dynasty period, a concubine lost 3 children to smallpox. Despite this, the charge of possessing a poisonous fate was leveled against her. As punishment, she was forced to spend the remaining approximately 40 years of her life confined to a single room. She was permitted to see no other member of the imperial family. Her crime was burying her children. Her punishment was dying alone. But no matter how brutal the daily life of the harem was, nothing could have prepared the women for what would happen in 1421. In 1421, the Yongle Emperor officially inaugurated the newly completed Forbidden City. He was at the height of his power. Then a rumor emerged, and it destroyed thousands of lives. One of the emperor's most beloved concubines was found dead. The official announcement stated that she had been poisoned, but an entirely different story was being whispered throughout the palace. According to the rumors, the woman had taken her own life when an affair with a palace eunuch was exposed. And circulating behind this scandal were whispers that the emperor was impotent. Yongle was consumed by rage. Humiliated and driven into paranoia, he launched an investigation. But what he sought was not justice. What he sought was the silencing of everyone who knew the rumor. In a single night, approximately 2,800 women of the harem were executed. Not only concubines, servants, cooks, laundresses, every woman in the palace who might have heard this rumor. The method of execution employed was lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts, a punishment designed to prolong suffering as long as possible. The executioners were specifically ordered to proceed slowly. For some of the victims, death took hours. Screams could be heard from every corner of the palace complex. Among those slaughtered were girls as young as 12. There were elderly women who had served in the palace for decades. There were even pregnant concubines. None survived. Everyone who might have heard the rumor, everyone who might have passed it on to another. When dawn broke, the courtyards were washed with buckets of water carried from the palace wells. Those same wells. The wells into which many women would throw themselves in desperation in the years that followed. There is no official record of this event in the Imperial documents. The Ming Dynasty palace erased this massacre from history, but one testimony survived, the account of Lady Kui. She had been outside the palace that night. She had obtained permission to visit an ailing relative. She survived by chance. She escaped the purge by a stroke of fortune. Years later, Lady Kui recounted what she had witnessed to a Korean envoy. She described in detail the screams that lasted until dawn, the courtyards made slippery with blood, how the eunuchs dragged bodies through the corridors she had walked every day. She spoke the names of the women she had known one by one, the girls with whom she had trained, the friends with whom she had shared the same table. Her testimony was preserved in a place beyond the reach of Ming Dynasty censorship, in the Korean diplomatic archives. It remains to this day one of the few first-hand accounts we possess. But Lady Kui's survival did not last long. 3 years later, when the Yongle Emperor died, she was among the women selected to accompany him. Her final recorded words, preserved by that same Korean envoy, were, "I survived the night of blood only to die wrapped in silk." Han, the young Korean woman at the beginning of our story, was also among the small number who survived that massacre. But this survival was temporary. 3 years later, when the emperor died, Han too was placed on the list of women selected for eternal honor. There was a practice called shunzang. Its meaning was simple: accompanying sacrifice. When an emperor died, some of his favored concubines would be buried alongside him, alive. The logic was simple and terrifying. The emperor would need companionship in the next world as well, and who could be more fitting than the women who had served him while he lived? 3 days after the emperor's death, the eunuchs would prepare a list of the women to be selected. The number varied according to the ruler, sometimes 5, sometimes 30 women. Those selected would be given one final magnificent meal. Foods they had never tasted in their lives, wines they were not ordinarily permitted to drink. Some accounts say musicians played during this time, as though a celebration were taking place. Afterward, the women would be presented with 2 options. The first, to hang themselves with white silk cords. This was considered an honorable death. The woman's family would be given financial compensation and granted an official honor. Some families, knowing that the alternative was even more terrible, attempted to persuade their daughters to accept this death willingly. The second option was to refuse. In that case, the eunuchs would intervene. The women could be forcibly hanged or sedated with opium until they lost consciousness. Some of their bodies, while still breathing, would be placed in chambers surrounding the main tomb, in a seated position. As though they were waiting. As though they were continuing to serve, even in death. When archaeologists opened the tomb of the Jingtai Emperor in 1958, they found the remains of 16 women in the inner chambers. All were in a seated position. Analysis showed that most had suffered neck trauma consistent with hanging. However, 3 skeletons bore different marks. Broken bones. Scratch marks on the stone walls. These women had been buried alive and had tried to get out. The practice of shunzang was officially abolished in 1464, but not out of mercy. The problem was political. The families of the sacrificed women had begun to show increasing resistance. Han, however, was not so fortunate. She died in 1424, approximately 40 years before the prohibition came into effect. She pleaded to be allowed to return to Korea to care for her aging mother. The new emperor rejected her petition. They hanged her with a white silk cord and buried her beside the man who had ruined her life. Han's death occurred before this practice was abolished. But even for the women who came after her, this prohibition did not mean freedom. In fact, it meant a fate that was in some ways even darker. The abolition of the accompanying sacrifice tradition brought no freedom. It brought only a different end. After decades of captivity, concubines who outlived their emperors would be sent to one of the most remote sections of the palace of eternal loneliness. This place was located in the most desolate corners of the Forbidden City. The rules were brief and severe. You shall never leave the complex. You shall not marry. You shall have no contact whatsoever with the outside world. You shall spend your days performing simple tasks. You shall pray 3 times daily for the deceased emperor. For years they lived in communal dormitories. They slept on mats. They ate plain meals. Illnesses were treated only when they posed a risk of spreading to others. Many women gradually lost their sanity. Some stopped eating until their bodies were completely exhausted. The most common means of escape was to jump into the wells in the gardens. In the 18th century, it is recorded that an average of 12 bodies were retrieved from these wells each year. The guards would remove the bodies under cover of darkness. There were no ceremonies. No records were kept. Simply one more number would be subtracted. The youngest widow on record was only 14 years old. After spending 3 months married to an elderly emperor, the man died. She spent the next 61 years in the palace of eternal loneliness. When she died at 75, she had spent virtually her entire adult life in mourning for a man she had barely known. One of the final chapters of the Imperial concubinage system extends into the 20th century. Wanrong, the last empress of China, died in 1946. She spent her final years in a communist prison. She was addicted to opium. She died alone at 39 after losing her children. She was buried in an unmarked mass grave. The concubinage system officially came to an end, but the Forbidden City still stands, and what it chooses to remember and what it chooses to forget says a great deal. Today, approximately 14 million tourists visit the Forbidden City each year. They pass through gilded courtyards. They gaze in admiration at the yellow rooftops. They take photographs in front of the imperial thrones. Tour guides speak of magnificent architecture and imperial power, but they do not speak of the palaces of eternal loneliness. They do not show visitors the wells from which bodies were retrieved every week, nor do they explain why the Palace of Compassion and Tranquility was sealed off and used as a storage facility for years. Officials have long been trying to dispel the rumors of a cursed palace, but no one asks the question, why did these rumors arise in the first place? Because on some walls the marks of hands that clawed in desperation still remain. Han was 16 when she was placed in that carriage. She was 32 when she was hanged with a white silk cord. During those 16 years, she never saw her mother again. She never returned to her homeland. She never again heard a voice speak her real name with love. She was sold as tribute. She was trained like an object. She was used as a tool. And in the end, she was buried like an accessory. Moreover, Han was not alone. Historians estimate that over the approximately 2,000-year history of Imperial China, more than 100,000 women passed through the concubinage system. Most of their names were never entered into any record. Most of their stories were never told. They were merely numbers in accounting ledgers, bodies in graves, and ghosts drifting through the palaces where tourists take photographs today. The Forbidden City still stands. Modern China often prefers to celebrate its history, but examining the human cost of that history is less comfortable. It is a difficult truth to accept that the same civilization which invented gunpowder and the compass also systematized the suffering of women. But silence does not honor the victims. Forgetting does not bring justice. The walls of the Forbidden City still stand. The stones still remember. And now, so do you. This is Sable Historians, the place where history's darkest moments are brought into the light. If you've made it this far, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next one.